Good morning. Welcome and thank you for joining us on this panel session on addressing forced labour and responsible recruitment. It's our goal in what we have now a whole 50 minutes to provide you, and what we're keen to do is to provide you with some practical takeaways on what businesses can do to address risks within your businesses and within your supply chains. And we're going to address this through this panel with each of us focusing on a different area. So focusing on at state level, at a sector level, at a collaborative program and individual organisational level. So whilst we all settle in, I'm going to press this button and I'm hoping by absolute magic this question appears. So this is for all of you who have downloaded the app, and I hope you all have, and are ready to answer this question. Which of your businesses has an agreed prohibition on recruitment costs charged to worker policy? Now your choices are, yeah, we've got a fully developed policy, it's all in place, it's all working well. That's the first option. The second one, we've got a commitment to prohibit recruitment costs throughout our business, and we'll be developing this in the year ahead. Third option, nothing in place yet, but we are planning to develop this. And fourth option, nothing in place, no plans to develop. So vote away, please, and we'll see where we are on this as the technology gears into life. So very exciting red bar filling up there. We're getting there. Good work, folks. Vote now, vote now. And we have 30% of you, so 3 in 10 of you in this room, well done, fully developed and working policy. That's shifting down to a quarter. We've got about half the room saying, yeah, we've got an agreed commitment to implement it. I haven't touched anything. And the rest, those of you who've got a better memory than me will know where we were on those. So, just some introductions, a quick minute or two. If we could go from my left, quick introductions. Can you introduce yourself and your work, please?
Hi everyone. So I'm delighted to see that quite a few companies have got a recruitment policy because it's really important. I'm Neil Wilkins from the Institute for Human Rights and Business. For those of you who don't know us, we're a civil society organisation that does pretty much what it says on the tin. We try to encourage business to engage better with human rights. And we advise businesses and governments on how that might happen. We have a particular focus, on my particular focus, I'm head of the Migrant Workers Programme, so I'm interested in migrant workers right the way across all sectors and in all geographic locations.
Thank you, Neil. Introduction from myself. My name's David Camp. I head up an organisation called Alliance HR, supporting businesses to drive systemic human rights improvements in their supply chains. We run a number of programs. We run a program called Stronger Together, a multi-stakeholder initiative working in different sectors and countries, supporting businesses to address forced labour in their businesses and supply chains. Fast Forward, a labour standards improvement program. Clearview, a global labour provider certification program, and our most newly launched program, the Responsible Recruitment Toolkit, which is a one-stop online toolkit supporting businesses to implement and adopt responsible recruitment practices.
Thank you. So my name is Robin Bishop. I am the head of Strategic Engagement at Impact. Impact is a leading consultancy that specializes in ethical trade or responsible sourcing or human rights in business, whatever terminology resonates with you. But essentially, we believe that putting worker welfare at the heart of supply chains is better for business. And it just obviously makes a lot of sense to everybody in this room that a happy, healthy worker who's treated fairly without abuse or discrimination or exploitation is going to stay in that job for longer, they're going to be more productive, and quality will improve. So at Impact, we enable organizations to improve working conditions and livelihoods across their global supply chains, using our evidence-based approaches to really look at what are the root causes of social compliance issues, and then give them the tools they need to build better relationships with workers, which not only improves the working conditions, but improves competitiveness and ends up with a better performing supply chain.
Hello, I'm Lucy Kehan and I'm the Franchise Director for Waves Hand Car Wash. We supply franchise hand car washes into retail parks across the UK. I'm also the Chair of the Responsible Car Wash Scheme, which is a non-government organisation that launched in October 2018 and is currently in trial in the Midlands to raise standards across an industry that often is epidemic within exploitation and worker rights being removed. So it's a really good scheme that is hopefully going into launch across the whole of the UK later this year.
Thank you, panel. So we're going to have one round going through the panel, because we want to focus in this first round on what actually can be achieved. So positive things that have been achieved in recent years, which have actually made a difference. So starting with you, Neil, businesses focus on, understandably focus on their own actions. So why is it important for them to leverage and influence governments at a state level? Sometimes when these problems seem so big and so intractable. Can you give us any examples of work that businesses have done that have actually made a difference?
Yeah, could I have my slides up, please, starting with that Dakar Principles slide. One back, that's the one. So the Dakar Principles for Migration with Dignity, they were developed by IHRB back in 2011. Some of you might have come across them before. When we started to do work around migrant workers, we realised that actually there was quite a bit out there, but it was all rather bitty. There was a bit over here and a bit over there and a guidance here and a legislation here. And the Dakar Principles were an attempt to pull everything into one usable framework. So it's a framework intended for businesses and for governments to understand all of the challenges that migrant workers might face at different parts of a typical migration cycle. And you'll see, if you look around, perhaps around numbers 4, 5, 6, 7, that companies are starting to undertake work around that area. You know, we're seeing companies paying attention to their supply chains, making sure that trade unions perhaps are represented, making sure perhaps that living wages are being paid and that pay and conditions and other factors are being addressed. And companies are pursuing that with various degrees of success and enthusiasm. But for migrant workers, you really need to go right back to the start of the cycle, which is around number 1, and this issue of recruitment fees. We were talking a lot this morning about modern slavery and what does that actually look like. And we were talking about it being a systemic issue. And recruitment fees are a really good example of that. You know, what does modern slavery look like in practice? And it looks like the payment of recruitment fees, sometimes enormous sums, to secure employment abroad. And so when companies come to start tackling modern slavery, paying attention to this is exactly the sort of thing that they should be doing. Could you click on, please? And we see that the payment of recruitment fees put migrant workers frequently into debt. Debts accumulate as they go through a recruitment process, and they end up in a situation of debt bondage, which is an indicator of modern slavery. And this model can be found in the supply chains right the way across the global south, but also in Europe and in America. Next slide, please. So, 2 years ago, we formed the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment. We've got a collection of, I'm hoping, 14 brands, all committed to improving recruitment conditions within their supply chains, very similar to the question that you yourselves have just answered. So these companies have all committed to work to prohibit recruitment fees being charged in their supply chains, and to promote a new kind of model based on, and if you can flick on please, the employer pays principle. So the employer pays principle states quite clearly, no worker should pay for a job. The costs of recruitment should be borne not by the worker, but by the employer. It's a business cost. We set this up this way. We don't just say no recruitment fees. We need to say, well, somebody needs to pay recruitment fees. You know, recruitment is a business cost, just like health and safety is a business cost. And so we call it the employer pays principle to make very clear that business should be picking up this tab. So the companies who are members of the leadership group have all been working to promote the employer pays principle and employer pays models within their own supply chain and within their extended sphere of influence. So I'll stop there, David, and we can get back into the government bit in the next round of questions, perhaps.
Good. Thank you, Neil. Not only am I moderating, but I'm also a panellist as well, so I'm multitasking. So I'm going to talk a little bit about work at an industry level, at a sector level, and I want to talk a little bit about Stronger Together over the last few years. We started in 2013 as a good idea, and it's grown since then. And the principle behind it is for sectors on a country by country, a sector by sector level to collaborate. Stakeholders from brands, retailers, NGOs, businesses, anyone who wants to get involved. And Stronger Together produces pragmatic, practical guidance, toolkits, resources, posters, leaflets, videos, questionnaires, policies, whatever will support ordinary business folk in ordinary businesses to put in place these practices to address the risk of forced labour and hidden labour exploitation in their business. We run a wide range of workshops to really engage people in this programme. We've trained in UK consumer goods sector about 4,000 managers from about 2,000 businesses, and many cases of hidden labour exploitation have been covered. We've made good progress in addressing recruitment fees charged to workers in the UK, and the feedback that we've had is that 3/4 of the businesses we've engaged with, the senior management team, have put in place programs and processes to address forced labour within their business and within their supply chain. Still huge amounts of work to do. We've moved on and we're doing work in the UK construction sector, in South African fruit and wine, and we're just about to launch a programme in the States. Lessons that we've learned from it is that collaboration is absolutely key to it. Talking to businesses, engaging with businesses, giving them the tools free is an important element, and actually giving and helping business and supporting businesses to put in the practical steps that they can to address those risks. So huge amounts of work to do, but positive results achieved in the first few years. So Robin, moving from a sector to an individual business level, can you give examples of where companies have successfully addressed forced labour and debt bondage, and how was this achieved in your experience?
Sure. And as Neil said, what modern slavery looks like in principle is the payment of recruitment fees. So that's what I'm going to focus on right now. We've had some, most recently, examples in Malaysia, where we've worked across a whole host of sectors, from furniture to garments to rubber gloves to condoms, and to really do two things. And that was to investigate whether or not forced labor was happening on that site, those particular sites, and then what we do about it. And so I'm going to talk you through a little bit about the impact approach to addressing this. And we really feel that a traditional social audit is just not fit for purpose to uncover forced labor. The indicators of forced labor are so subtle that it's hard to fit them within a checklist of what is compliant versus non-compliant. And also, the traditional social audit tends to give lip service to worker interviews, which I'm going to talk quite a lot about. So we feel that a much more exploratory investigative approach is what is needed, and that means that the worker story becomes absolutely vital. So a couple things that we do differently: we send a dedicated forensic auditor as well as a dedicated worker interviewer. And this worker interviewer is trained in social psychology approaches and is really designed to build rapport with the worker and to let them experience the telling of the narrative in their own voice. We put more weighting on the worker interview over management interviews or review of documents. We have a much higher sample size of who we interview, so about 70% of the workforce when there is suspected forced labor. We also set up a grievance hotline that tends to be manned by the interviewers who ran that investigation. And because sometimes the workers may not feel comfortable in having a conversation on the site, or they might not feel the trust is developed yet. So through the grievance hotline with that original worker interviewer, they're able to share at a much later date if that's how they feel they'd like to do things. So given a recent example, when it comes to remediation, we have 4 pillars that guide our approach. And the first of which is that the worker must remain at the center. So they have to feel tangible impact of actions. The worker must also be safeguarded and secured from any harm. We must also ensure that workers are reimbursed the fees that they have paid, and I'll come on to that in a minute. And also they should have access to a higher quality of jobs. So responsible hiring and management practices should be implemented in the factory or the site. So in a recent example, companies came together, so a group of buyers, to work together on a joint corrective action plan with the site, which had improvement goals that really then became the backbone of that remediation plan. So the CAP set out specifically what would good look like in practice, and it also created accountability for the plan on what the agreements were. We then look at specific support for that factory in terms of where they need capacity building to meet the objectives that are set out in the plan. So as an example, we uncovered that there were a lot of cultural breakdowns between workers and the management in this particular site. And so we implemented a training program that we run called Restart, which is designed to rehumanize workers to management and also empower workers at the same time. And it essentially just builds that bridge to a better working relationship. We also ensure that we introduce regular checkup calls with the group to see, okay, what else is needed to drive this remediation forward? So one of the things I wanted to say about the repayment of recruitment fees, we feel very strongly that all workers should be reimbursed for the fees that they have paid. But at the same time, you need to be sensitive to the financial situation of that site. So it may be that you introduce a repayment schedule so as not to bankrupt the factory at the same time. So that's just some examples recently of the way that we've been approaching identifying forced labor in a factory or on a site, and then looking at that remediation, and that primarily is driven by the payment of recruitment fees and also capacity building of that site to get the right policies and procedures in place from the outset.
Thanks, Robin. Lucy, I think your experiences are similar but a bit different. You work in a sector in the UK that we all know is high risk, cases of severe cases of labour exploitation, cases of modern slavery, an unregulated sector. Can you share how such a disparate sector can actually come together to improve its practices and to affect change.
Yeah, you're right, David. It's one of the most fascinating areas to explore, where workers are very vulnerable, often have very limited language skills, and are often put into working environments where they are not given any protection, including working in flip-flops with chemicals that may contain acid. So here in the UK, it's something that we drive past every day, and we can see set up on the sides of the roads, and you can see car washes that just are not even charging the right amount for the number of workers that are on site. So that's one very visual sign. Back in 2017, some of you here today can see some familiar faces, will know that I became very passionate about the car wash industry and started talking to the then Paul Broadbent at the GLAA, and anyone who would listen to me, really, and some like-minded responsible sourcing managers across retail. And we got together and talked about how could we help this industry, but at the same time address potentially the issues that were within our own areas. From that, we started to work with the GLAA and HSC and the Environment Agency, and just really talking and not giving up, promoting the risk within this industry. That led us to come together and invite other industry owners into the group and set up the Responsible Car Wash Scheme, which is being run by the Down Fuel Stream Association, and they lead on forecourt legalities. So often car washes are set up on disused forecourts, but landlords are actually responsible for these sites. And the scheme is designed to hold landlords accountable, but also really focus and put workers at the heart of any site visit. So when they arrive on site, it's education and also offering opportunities, like you said, for them to be able to speak to the same person in a language that they understand, and highlight together and work to raise the standard in an industry so that we don't ever see people working in flip-flops here in the UK.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. We're going to have another round, and the purpose of this next time we go round is for the panel to, in their experience, to give some real practical takeaways that hopefully will be of use to you after this conference is over, and thoughts that you can take back into your business. Two things. First off, we're going to have another question where we all join in. Secondly, on your app, there is the opportunity to ask the panel any questions. We've got a few that have come through. There's one or two that are very, very difficult, and I'm just thinking who to share those with. But please, if you have any questions, any thoughts that you would like to share, please submit your questions. But the second question that we're going to ask the audience to feedback on is, which of your businesses has a forced labour remediation policy in place? And the options again are, the first one is yes, we have, it's fully developed, the processes are applied and it's working well in our business and supply chain. Second option, we're currently developing it. We've got something, but we're currently developing it. Third option, nothing in place, but we're planning to developing it. And fourth option, nothing in place and no plans to develop. So, looking like pretty much even. So there are 1 in 6 of you in this room who haven't got a remediation policy, no plans to develop one. But amongst the others, reasonably split on those of you that, yeah, we've got a remediation policy, we're comfortable that it's pretty good and working. Again, about the same, about a quarter. We're currently developing our policy, and 30% of you on nothing in place, but we're going to be working on it this year. So, look, I think those figures are pretty positive from where we were a little while ago, where I think if we just stepped back a couple of years, those figures would have been massively, massively less on that. So to say that come a year's time, when I ask that question again, over 80% of the businesses in the room will have their own remediation policy. So I think that's a positive answer. Neil, can you, and we're going to move on to takeaways for the audience.
Yep.
Can you give the businesses in the room some realistic and practical actions that they can take in the months ahead, collaborative actions that they can take to leverage governments?
Very much so. With governments in particular, so I think the first thing is to make sure that you're coming from a situation where you know what you're talking about. So inform yourself, map your supply chain for labour, understand what countries workers are coming from, what are the existing recruitment processes, and there are actually a surprising number of tools out there that can help you do this. There are things like the US TIP report. There's the ILO and the IOM produce country briefings. All of these are very accessible documents. They're not, and I have to read a lot of ILO papers, and we all know that some of them are quite useful for falling asleep on long plane journeys. But there are other short briefing documents that can be very, very useful, very pertinent to your work. When we're talking about migrant workers, please always remember that you need a corridor approach. So it's not just where those workers are being employed, but of course, where are they coming from? Is that an at-risk country? We would say engage with local NGOs. This is particularly pertinent where trade unions perhaps aren't present. And in countries, some countries, NGOs can fulfill a really useful role. And our own experience of this within the leadership group companies is there's an umbrella organisation operating in Asia called Migrant Forum in Asia. So they're an umbrella organisation of groups of different NGOs operating in many of the countries down there. And we got representatives from Migrant Forum Asia to come and speak to our leadership group companies. And it was a brilliant feedback loop. The companies were learning so much. I was a bit nervous about facilitating the meeting because I thought they're going to use it to have a pop at the companies, and it wasn't like that at all. The NGOs came, they were very business focused, they knew what the companies were going to want to hear, but they also knew what they wanted to say, and it was a really good relationship. And subsequently it's led to us, MFA, Migrant Forum in Asia, are now full members of the leadership group because we feel that this was such an important way of including a worker voice and the organisations that actually represent the workers that we're all talking about. So those collaborations, however you can forge them, are really, really useful and provide a whole wealth of knowledge for you. And then the other thing that we'd recommend is to work within your existing trade association or professional body. Does that group itself, we've asked what companies have a policy, but does your trade association, your professional body, do they have a policy about that? Do they have a principle about this? Do they have a working group set up to take this through? And is it good enough? You know, sometimes there are policies, but they're pretty thin gruel when you actually look at them. Yes, we have zero tolerance of modern slavery, and it means absolutely nothing. What practical steps are your trade association putting in place? And how can you, as a member of that association, expand your influence within it to promote better practice, to try to make sure that your association is leading its members rather than being rather afraid of their members. And we've seen good progress across a number of associations. To give you one example, the International Tourism Partnership last year committed that no worker should pay for a job, and have now established various working groups to try to see that throughout the hospitality industry. So that's an example of how it can work in practice. So whatever bodies you're already a member of, however you can expand your influence, that's a really important way of adding collective brand leverage to some of the things that we would like to see, and then your trade association can then approach government.
Thank you, Neil. So I'm going to raise sort of 2 or 3 issues. Social auditing took a bit of a savaging in the last session. I think it does have a purpose. I think it needs to evolve. I think traditional social audits need to become more effective at highlighting the indicators of forced labour. Some progress has been made over the last couple of years. More work needs to be done to highlight the indicators of forced labour. But my view is that we're kind of looking at the wrong thing. We need to be moving upstream, and we need to be looking at the preventative measures that businesses have put in place to prevent forced labour, to prevent debt bondage, to prevent hidden labour exploitation taking place in their business. So we need to move away from we need to move on. We need to evolve from social auditing mechanisms being comply, don't comply, to them being continuous improvement tools that businesses use to become better at managing labour risks in their business. So that's the first comment that I would make. Second comment I would make is that we need common good practice model remediation policies, model elimination of recruitment fees policies at state and industry level. And we need to have a proper conversation about this. We've done our best in Stronger Together and at the Responsible Recruitment Toolkit to give model policies. I think they can be improved. I always think things can be improved. I would like to see over the next year with brands, with retailers, at a national level, us having a conversation about how we develop common principles, common best practice remediation policies, because I do believe that every business should have in place its own forced labour prevention and remediation policies. This is all achievable in the near future, in the year ahead, in 2 years ahead. This is achievable.
Luckily, me going third, you two have trumped 2 of mine, which is great. You should be off the hook, Lucy. So I just wanted to agree with Neil that I believe, and with you, David, that we need to really focus on understanding the recruitment process from the outset. So how the migrant workers in your supply chain are recruited. So this is not only going to help remediation when it comes to factory level, but also in terms of industry collaboration and really driving change. again, coming back to the point about the evolution of the social audit, really putting a much heavier emphasis on the worker voice piece, and consider hiring dedicated worker interviewers who have a different skill set than auditing. So it's really about running an interview that's conversational in nature. It's about really trying to understand that worker's perspective, so their journey, what their experience has been, what their aspirations are. You'll uncover a lot more. So I was going to say my last takeaway would be to be bold and to move away from the need to triangulate data. And I want to flesh this out with quite an example we're quite proud of at Impact. So we are the external monitor and consultants to the Supreme Committee of Qatar for the FIFA 2022 World Cup. And the Supreme Committee is responsible for the development of the infrastructure, so the building of the stadiums and all of the various bits that go into running that tournament. So we've interviewed about thousands of workers at tens of thousands of contractors. 95% of those workers had shared with us that they had paid recruitment fees and had been misled at some point along the recruitment process and were indebted. But when we triangulated this data, so found receipts, we only had receipts from 2 workers from 1 contractor. When we presented these receipts back to the contractor, they shared with us that they didn't have the right government stamp from that country and there was nothing they could do. So who do you believe in that instance? Well, luckily the Supreme Committee decided to put a greater weighting on the testimony of the workers, and we've helped them to facilitate the repayment of $20 million to 30,000 workers, which has made a huge impact on the lives of those workers, getting them out of debt bondage and being able to do what they set out to do in the first place, and taking that role, create a better life for themselves and their families. So I would say to be bold, because just because it is difficult and it is hard, and the fact that these workers have paid fees is likely somebody else's fault, we can't just go, oh dear, and cut and run or not do anything about it. And even if you can't make a perfect repayment, it's really time for us in the private sector to carve out exactly what we can do to help address the payment of recruitment fees and ensure that that reimbursement is happening, and working together to do that.
Thank you, Robin. Lucy, you're very much on this journey with the work that you're doing. So far, the experiences you've had so far, what are the key learnings that you would like to share with the room?
Key learnings: don't give up, be brave, and seek out those who think the same as you, and together you can make a massive change. Collaboration is definitely a way forward, and that's ourselves, audit companies, and also government organisations working together is the biggest takeaway. Be brave. Why do you say be brave? Because there's plenty of people who want to stop you. Plenty of people. Be brave and be true to yourself and keep going, because what you see in front of you and what you wanted to change initially has to be your key driver.
Okay. Thank you. We have a few questions, and we have a few minutes left for those questions. And on this tablet here, I get a league table of questions. So the most popular question goes to the top. And the most popular question we have, and I'll probably ask Neil and Robin to address this one. The question is, what do businesses do? So it's a practical question. It's a real challenging issue when forming your repayment of recruitment fees. What do businesses do when they pay a lot of money for employees to travel and start work, and then that worker leaves after a week? How can businesses make sure that this system isn't abused by people, especially as it becomes more common that employers must pay for travel from home countries? Any thoughts on that one, Neil?
Yeah, and it absolutely does come up, and it's what should be included in a recruitment cost is a series of some debate. Most organisations have come down on the side that it should include absolutely everything, and that includes recruitment costs. Otherwise, you will that should include transport costs, which for many migrant workers, of course, are the largest component of any recruitment fee. And the ILO, for instance, have now come up with a definition of recruitment fees. There are others out there. The EICC, now the RBA, have one. There's a FAR definition in America as well. But all of them conclude that you should include transport costs. Now, this issue about repayment, if a worker moves on, absconds, however you like to call it, does come up, and it's frequently talked about. The first thing that we would like to say is that we would like to see a bit more data about that. We hear it all the time, but there seems to be a real lack of hard evidence about how prevalent it actually is. And amongst the entire workforce that you might be recruiting, what percentage of workers is it actually happening to? What is the attrition rate? Because within all businesses, there is a rate of attrition and an unexpected cost for business, and it needs to start being factored in. When we've got better data about it, it might also be possible that companies could insure themselves against that. The other thing that I'd say, and I don't want to take everything from Robin, is that it comes down to proper recruitment processes in the first place. If you've got a decent recruitment process in place, and you've got a decent recruiter who is going and finding the ideal candidate for you, they are far less likely to then move on, because the job matches their expectations. That they haven't been cheated, they haven't been tricked, they haven't been made a whole load of false promises that will then encourage them to move on. We also know that very often workers move on because when they get to a place of employment, they find that the pay and conditions don't match what they were promised. They're not earning enough to service the recruitment debt that got them there in the first place. And that's one of the main reasons that workers will then abscond and look for better paid employment, because they're trying to service recruitment debt. So the whole thing is a virtuous cycle. So those are the things that we talk about.
I think that was a good and quite a full answer. So I think I'm going to give Robin a different question. I'm just going to add to that question, Neil, that I get that question lots of times, and I think it's a question, and I'll be absolutely honest with you. I take on board everything Neil says, and my answer to that question is I don't know. Yep, and that's why we get asked the question, because we haven't worked on an answer for it yet, and we need to work on an answer. We need to have those conversations, and we need to come up with a solution that works, that isn't able to be brought out. Oh, we can't do this because of this issue. We have to, as business people and those of us who work in this sector, we need to come up with an answer that works, that recognises that in certain cases this is going to happen, and what do we do to prevent it? And how do we deal with it when it happens? But at the moment, I don't know. I don't have the perfect answer to that question. But in the time that we have, and Robin, you actually you touched on this in your previous example. There's a couple of questions which are very similar. One says, what evidence would you suggest that a company needs to demonstrate that an employee has paid a recruitment fee? That's the first question. And the second one is, how do you guarantee a worker has paid fees when often the services they have paid for don't come with a receipt and the figures are then open to abuse? So 2 questions.
Okay, I'll just kind of amalgamate. It's going to be a fairly short answer in that the work that we've done, we haven't guaranteed it. We've based it on the worker testimony because there haven't been the right recruitment processes in place from the outset for that recruiter to be able to provide any sort of receipt and for that worker to understand that they're supposed to be gathering receipts. Now, if you think about through that recruitment journey, how many times money is handed over and the worker doesn't actually know what that fee is being paid for, I would say that it comes back to Daniil's point in terms of working with better recruiters, having a better explanation at the outset so that onboarding process for the worker to understand what these fees are if they're being paid. But from what we've been doing for the companies that we've been working on behalf of, we've taken it on the worker testimony in terms of what they've said they paid. And what's really interesting is when you interview, if a subset, so if you interview Bangladeshi workers, Indian workers, they're all around the same median. There's no great discrepancy. So people are not trying to cheat the system. You have very, very similar answers in terms of what that national average would look like. So from our experience at this point, rather than getting held up in we don't have a receipt and we're not going to move forward, we actually take that worker testimony on behalf of the clients but would recommend a much more robust recruitment process so that the worker knows what they need to have receipts for and what they don't.
David, I think, you can also ask the company, have you paid the recruitment fee? If you've paid the recruitment fee, where's the invoice, where's the receipt, where's the service level agreement that might prove that you, as a company, if you're being audited as a company, how can you prove that you've been trying to do the right thing as well?
Good, thank you. 2 minutes left. Looking at the next, what role can technology play in developing solutions to encourage responsible recruitment? I've got a good answer to this one, but anyone? Please have a look at Responsible Recruitment Toolkit, and you can register for free. That's kind of my answer on it. But anyone else? Any other suggestions on technology?
I think in our industry, technology has certainly helped us to help our franchisees to understand the process of recruitment. So actually what is required in asking for passport information or actually uploading a pay slip, so that actually makes them think about, they need a pay slip. So I think there is part of the education process, technology plays a huge part.
Thank you.
I think, David, as well, as there are all sorts of mobile phone apps and things like that are all about harvesting information from workers. The best ones that we see are the ones where workers are sharing information with other workers. Good examples would be Golden Dreams, which is set up by ISRA in Myanmar, and Contratados, which is one for Mexican workers going through the Mexican-American corridor. Both of those are very worker-driven, and it's workers sharing information rather than being top-down. I think there's always a danger with technology that it encourages companies to step back when actually they should be stepping in, and it becomes some kind of modern-day audit at a step removed. Technology should only really be used as an accompaniment to all of the other things that we would want to see companies doing. This engagement, it's about engagement that's important. If your technology is used as a tool for engagement and understanding workers better, and then there's decent and proper follow-up activity, then I think that's great. The danger with technology is that it sort of atomizes workers, and workers then become responsible for reporting violations of their own rights. And that's not right. The companies should be have that responsibility, or governments.
Thank you, Neil. One thing I would add is that we're seeing more and more workers forming their own WhatsApp groups. There's things out like Recruitment Advisor. You're seeing different feedback mechanisms, and these are only going to increase, where workers just say what they feel, just say what they've experienced, and companies' reputations are going to depend on what those workers say about those businesses. And increasingly, when a workforce is a valuable commodity, what workers say about your business will be absolutely central. I'd like to thank, on your behalf, Neil, Robin and Lucy, and to echo what Lucy said, that committed individuals in responsible businesses can mitigate the risk of forced labour in their own companies and supply chains, and by working together can change sometimes what seem like seemingly intractable practices. So I'd like to thank all of you who strive to make that change, and I wish you all success in doing so.